The universe was alive with a buzz of activity, filled with thriving civilizations across countless worlds. From the bright lights of advanced space stations to the hum of bustling alien cities, life seemed to be at its peak. But one day, something strange and terrifying appeared. No one knew where it came from, but within weeks, every civilization, every species, began to fall. A mysterious virus spread quickly, faster than anything the universe had ever seen. It didn't take long before entire planets fell silent, their inhabitants lost to the deadly plague. It didn't matter how advanced a species was. The virus found a way in, and it destroyed everything. Humanity on Earth had heard rumors. At first, they thought it was a distant problem, something that would never affect them. Alien species were always known to struggle with diseases and plagues. But then the news came. The virus had reached their corner of the galaxy. At first, it seemed like a small issue. It was just a flu-like virus, they thought. But it was worse than anyone could imagine. Within days, the first reports came in that entire cities were being wiped out. Hospitals filled with infected people, but there was no cure. The virus spread through the air, through water, through anything that could carry it. It was a silent killer, invisible to the naked eye. The world governments scrambled, trying to contain the spread, but it was already too late. The first real sign of trouble came when the virus started to attack the human population in a way no one expected. It didn't just kill them, it mutated them. Their bodies twisted and changed. People who were once healthy became violently ill, their skin turning pale and their eyes sinking into their faces. Their bodies stopped functioning in the way they should. It wasn't just death that the virus brought. It was a slow, painful death that no one could stop. Desperation set in. People tried everything. The smartest minds in the world worked day and night to find a cure, but it was no use. The virus adapted faster than they could find answers. Every attempt to develop a vaccine failed. Every attempt to contain the virus only made it worse. Soon, entire countries were wiped out. Whole continents were emptied. There was nothing left but a world in chaos, with people running scared and hiding wherever they could. As the virus spread, the human race faced extinction. Families were torn apart, and whole communities vanished. The world became a shadow of itself. Once bustling cities became abandoned ruins, their streets empty and silent. The virus didn't stop, and the world seemed to collapse into an endless nightmare. But through all the destruction, something strange began to happen. Small groups of people who were somehow immune to the virus started to emerge. These people didn't fall ill, didn't suffer the same fate as everyone else. But no one knew why. It was a mystery. How were these people able to survive? Scientists, doctors, and experts from all over the world worked together in secret to try and understand what was happening. They studied the survivors, hoping to find the key to fighting back. Some of them had been exposed to the virus and showed no symptoms. Others had never been exposed at all. But they all shared one thing in common. Their bodies didn't react the same way to the virus as everyone else's. In the first few months of the pandemic, no one thought much of it. But as the death toll grew higher and more people vanished, the survivors became a focal point. They were the last hope. They were the ones who had somehow managed to resist the virus, and the world began to look to them for answers. But no one understood why they were immune. Some believed it was luck, while others thought it might be a genetic anomaly. Still, others whispered that there was something more to it. Something more than chance. The virus didn't stop. It didn't care about who was immune or who wasn't. It spread like wildfire, leaving nothing but death in its wake. As the months passed, the survivors began to realize something frightening. They weren't the only ones left. Other species, other creatures from distant planets, had also survived. But just like humanity, these species were not unscathed. The virus had killed most of their kind, and only a few had managed to resist its effects. But what did it mean? Why had the virus come? Who had created it? These were the questions the survivors began to ask. As they gathered in small groups, trying to make sense of the world they now found themselves in. They realized one thing: humanity was not alone in this fight. There were others out there, survivors from different planets, all struggling with the same thing. But who were these other survivors, and what did they want? Were they here to help, or were they a threat? As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the survivors began to adapt. They grew stronger. They became more united. They learned to survive in this new world, learning the land and figuring out ways to stay safe. The virus had taken so much from them, but it hadn't taken everything. They had each other. They had hope. They had the chance to rebuild. But deep in the shadows, something else was happening. Something no one could have expected. As the survivors tried to rebuild their lives, they began to notice strange signs. The virus had not just been a random disaster. There was something else at play, something deeper. The virus was not just killing species, it was changing them. The survivors who had managed to adapt weren't just immune. They were evolving. Something was happening inside them, something that made them different. They were changing in ways they couldn't explain. As the survivors gathered in secret to share their findings, they realized that they weren't just fighting to stay alive anymore. They were fighting to understand their new reality. They were evolving, adapting in ways that no one could predict. They were becoming something new, something stronger. But the question remained: why? Why had humanity survived when no other species had? Why were they evolving in such strange ways? And most importantly, what would they become? The world seemed to hold its breath as humanity stood on the edge of something unknown, with the fate of the entire planet hanging in the balance. The virus had destroyed everything, but somehow, humanity had found a way to adapt. And now, as they looked to the future, they knew one thing: they were not going down without a fight. Whatever the virus had done to them, it wasn't enough to destroy them. Humanity would survive. They would fight back, and they would evolve. The months dragged on, and Earth began to show signs of a new era. The virus had decimated the population, leaving only a fraction of humanity behind. In every corner of the world, small groups of immune survivors started to emerge. These survivors had not been infected, but they were far from untouched. Their lives had been thrown into chaos, their homes lost, their families gone. Yet, they still held on. Some had fled to remote areas of the planet. Others banded together for safety. All of them were desperate, but slowly they began to realize that they had something extraordinary: the ability to resist the virus. In the early days after the virus had ravaged the Earth, the survivors couldn't comprehend what had happened. They looked around at the wreckage of their world, at the abandoned cities and villages, and wondered if there was any hope left. It was a time of confusion and fear. They didn't understand why they had survived when so many others had perished. What made them different? Were they truly the lucky ones, or was there something more to it? Among the survivors, a few had begun to notice strange changes in themselves. At first, it was subtle. People who had once felt weak and frail found themselves with bursts of energy. Those who had been injured in the past seemed to heal faster, their bodies recovering in ways that should have been impossible. Some even discovered enhanced senses, hearing noises they shouldn't have been able to hear, seeing in the dark, or smelling things miles away. But it wasn't just physical changes. Some survivors began to feel connected. They could sense things happening in other parts of the world, even without any obvious way to know. These strange, unexplainable abilities only grew stronger as the survivors adapted to their new reality. They couldn't stop the changes, but they didn't understand them either. No one knew what was happening, or why. What had caused this virus to spare them? Why did it seem to leave them untouched? And why were their bodies adapting in ways that no one had ever seen before? One group of survivors, led by Dr. Clara Matthews, a scientist who had narrowly escaped the initial wave of the virus, was determined to find out. She and her small team of researchers set up a makeshift laboratory in an abandoned building, hoping to study what was happening to them. They worked tirelessly, testing everything they could, but every answer only led to more questions. Through their experiments, they discovered that the virus wasn't simply a biological weapon, as they had initially suspected. There was something more to it. The virus had been engineered, not to destroy humanity, but to make it stronger. The survivors' immunity wasn't just random. It was the result of an ancient genetic code buried deep within their DNA. As Dr. Matthews and her team delved deeper into their research, they uncovered an astonishing truth. Long before the virus arrived, humans had been part of a grand experiment. The virus wasn't the first attempt to alter humanity's evolution. It was just the latest. Over thousands of years, humans had unknowingly been exposed to forces that had been trying to guide them toward a higher state of being. The virus, they realized, had been the catalyst for the next phase in human evolution. It was a test, one that had been placed on Earth long ago. The survivors were part of something much bigger than they had ever imagined. Their adaptation wasn't just a lucky fluke. It was the result of an ancient plan. And now, they were the ones who would carry humanity forward into an unknown future. But not everyone was pleased with these discoveries. While some survivors embraced the idea of becoming something new, others were terrified. They didn't want to change. They didn't want to evolve into something they couldn't understand. They wanted to hold on to the way things were before the virus, before the world had fallen apart. There was fear in the air, as some began to question whether these changes were a blessing or a curse. As tensions grew among the survivors, another group emerged. They called themselves the Resistors. Led by a man named Alan Blackwood, the Resistors were determined to fight against the changes. They believed that humanity's survival meant returning to the old ways, not evolving into something unrecognizable. They saw the changes in the survivors as unnatural, dangerous, and they wanted to stop it before it went too far. But the Resistors were not the only ones fighting for control of humanity's future. Elsewhere, in the remnants of abandoned cities, groups of survivors were beginning to form alliances, each with their own goals and dreams. Some wanted to rebuild the world as it was, while others saw the virus as a chance to build something entirely new. These new factions were spreading across the planet, each with their own vision of what the future should look like. And all the while, the virus continued to linger in the background, its true purpose still unclear. The survivors' immunity didn't make them invincible. It was just a step in a larger plan, one that no one fully understood. The world had changed, and now it was up to the survivors to decide what came next. The first signs of change came in the form of small, yet powerful discoveries. As the survivors explored abandoned cities, they began to uncover pieces of technology left behind by the alien civilizations that had once populated the universe. It was alien technology, far beyond anything humanity had ever seen, but it was clear that the survivors' new abilities were somehow linked to it. They began to realize that the virus had not just been a random act of destruction. It was part of something much larger. The technology they discovered seemed to react to their new powers, as though they were becoming part of a bigger system. As their bodies adapted, so too did the technology. This realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. The survivors understood that the world they had known was gone. The Earth they once called home was now part of a larger, more complex system, one that was connected to the stars, to other worlds, and to ancient forces that they couldn't yet comprehend. But the question remained, what did it all mean? Why had humanity been chosen for this strange new destiny? And what role would they play in the universe now that they were no longer the helpless species they had once been? As the survivors grappled with these questions, they began to realize that the future was no longer something they could control. The virus had set them on a path, one that would lead them into a future full of uncertainty and danger. But one thing was clear: humanity was no longer the same. They had adapted, they had evolved, and now they would have to face whatever came next. The days and weeks blurred together as the survivors continued to piece together the mystery behind the virus and the strange powers emerging within them. Dr. Clara Matthews and her team of scientists had made the breakthrough they were hoping for. They had discovered that the virus was not just a plague. It was a key to unlock something buried deep within human DNA. The virus had triggered an ancient evolutionary process, one that had been dormant for centuries. The survivors, now changed in ways they couldn't fully understand, were the first to awaken this power. The discovery sent shockwaves through the group. Some embraced the changes with open arms, while others feared what they were becoming. But no one could ignore the fact that their world had fundamentally shifted. The old Earth, the one they knew before the virus, was gone. The new Earth was a place of constant uncertainty, a world where the survivors' enhanced abilities and the alien technology they were discovering were their only tools for survival. As the survivors explored the ruins of old cities, they uncovered more than just technology. They discovered evidence of the ancient alien civilizations that had once ruled the stars. These civilizations, long destroyed by their own version of the virus, had left behind strange artifacts and ruins that held answers to many questions. The technology was advanced beyond human comprehension, but it was clear that it had been left behind for a reason. The virus had been part of a larger plan, a plan that connected humanity to the rest of the universe in ways they could never have imagined. Dr. Matthews, along with her closest allies, worked tirelessly to decipher the alien language and technology, hoping it would lead them to the answers they desperately needed. But as they dug deeper into the ruins, they began to uncover disturbing truths. The virus was not an accident. It had been created as a weapon, designed to test the ability of different species to adapt and evolve. The creators of the virus, an ancient alien race, had seeded it across the galaxy, observing which species would survive. The survivors were meant to be the next step in the evolution of intelligence and power, a new breed of beings who would rise above the rest. But the more they uncovered, the more questions arose. Why had humanity been chosen? Why had they been spared while other species had been wiped out? What made them so special? And why were these strange changes happening so quickly? Dr. Matthews and her team realized that the answers they were seeking were hidden deep within the alien technology they were studying, but the path to understanding it was fraught with danger. Every time they thought they were close to finding the truth, they stumbled upon new obstacles. The technology was not just advanced. It was alive, reacting to their presence in ways they couldn't explain. Meanwhile, other groups of survivors were forming, each with their own interpretations of the situation. Some saw the changes in the survivors as a blessing, a sign that humanity was destined for something greater. Others, like Alan Blackwood and his group of resistors, viewed the changes as an unnatural threat. They believed that humanity's survival should come from returning to the old ways, not by embracing these strange new powers. The resistors were growing in number, and their message of fear and distrust began to spread. Tensions between the different factions grew. Dr. Matthews and her allies were determined to push forward, to unlock the secrets hidden within the alien technology. But as they pressed on, they encountered more resistance. The resistors sabotaged their efforts, believing that the answers the scientists were seeking would lead to the downfall of humanity. They wanted to destroy the alien technology before it could do any more damage. But Dr. Matthews was convinced that the technology held the key to humanity's survival, and possibly to the survival of the universe itself. One night, as the group made their way through a massive underground alien facility, they discovered something that changed everything. Hidden deep within the structure was a large ancient chamber filled with complex machinery. At the center of the room was a massive device, unlike anything they had ever seen. It was a machine capable of controlling the virus, capable of manipulating the very fabric of life itself. The survivors realized that this machine had the power to either save them or destroy them all. But the discovery came with a price. The machine was not just a tool, it was a weapon. It had been designed to test and shape the evolution of species, but it had also been used to destroy entire civilizations. The survivors now faced a difficult choice. Should they use the machine to unlock the full potential of their new abilities, knowing that it could lead to more power, or should they destroy it, ensuring that no one could ever misuse it again. As they debated their next move, the resistors launched an attack. They believed that the machine was a trap, that it would ultimately lead to the destruction of humanity. They stormed the facility, determined to stop Dr. Matthews and her team from activating the device. The two factions clashed in the heart of the ancient alien structure, with the fate of humanity hanging in the balance. The battle was fierce. Dr. Matthews and her team fought to protect the machine, while the resistors fought to destroy it. In the chaos, the machine activated on its own, its ancient systems coming to life. The ground shook as energy surged through the room. The survivors, caught in the midst of the storm, were suddenly overwhelmed by a surge of power. Their bodies hummed with energy, their abilities amplified to unimaginable levels. The virus, once a curse, had now become the key to unlocking the new form of life. The survivors were no longer just immune. They were evolving into something beyond human. But the power was unstable. The machine was too powerful, and the energy it unleashed began to spiral out of control. Dr. Matthews and her team realized that they had no choice but to shut it down before it consumed everything. With the resistors closing in, they fought to reach the central control panel and deactivate the machine. Just as it seemed like all was lost, they managed to disable the device, halting the flow of energy. In the aftermath of the battle, the survivors were left to pick up the pieces. The machine had been destroyed, but its effects lingered. The survivors were no longer just humans. They had been transformed. They had evolved, but they had also become something new. Their bodies had adapted in ways they couldn't fully comprehend, but they knew that they were no longer bound by the limitations of their past. As the dust settled, the survivors realized that they were not just fighting for their own survival anymore. They had become part of something much larger, a new chapter in the history of the universe. The virus had been the beginning of their evolution, but it was up to them to decide what came next. They stood together, united in their uncertainty, but also in their newfound strength. The future was unclear, but one thing was certain: humanity had changed forever, and now it was up to them to figure out what kind of future they would create. The aftermath of the battle had left the survivors in a state of shock. The alien machine that had once promised answers, a future of unimaginable power, had been destroyed. Yet its effects remained, the changes irreversible. The survivors, once mere humans, now stood as something else entirely. The virus had altered their very essence, evolving them into beings that defied all logic. The power they had unlocked within themselves was both a gift and a curse, and none of them fully understood what it meant. In the weeks following the battle, the survivors dispersed into smaller groups, each trying to make sense of the changes they had undergone. Some embraced their new abilities, using them to protect one another and rebuild what little remained of their world. Others were fearful, unsure of what these changes would bring. They could feel the energy within them, like a pulse that ran through their veins, but they didn't know how to control it. Their enhanced senses were overwhelming at times, and the powers that had emerged seemed unpredictable, like a storm brewing beneath the surface. Dr. Clara Matthews, who had once led the effort to understand the virus and the alien technology, now found herself struggling to keep the survivors united. She had always believed in the potential for humanity to adapt, to evolve, but now she was unsure of what that evolution would look like. Was this the beginning of a new chapter in human history, or were they merely pawns in a much larger game they couldn't even comprehend? As the survivors continued to explore the alien ruins, they uncovered more fragments of information. The alien race that had created the virus was long gone, but their legacy lived on in the technology they had left behind. This ancient race, known as the Itar, had once been the most advanced civilization in the galaxy. They had created the virus as a way to test other species, to see which ones could survive and adapt. The Itar had believed that only the strongest species deserved to inherit the stars, and they had used the virus to weed out the weak. It became clear that humanity had been chosen not by chance, but because of something intrinsic in their DNA. The Yitar had seeded the virus across the galaxy, waiting for a species to rise above the rest. They had watched from afar, measuring the survival of each species, waiting to see who would emerge as the next rulers of the universe. But the Yitar had underestimated humanity. They had not anticipated the resilience, the determination that humans were capable of. The survivors had not just adapted, they had evolved, surpassing anything the Yitar could have imagined. The changes they had undergone were not just physical, they were mental and spiritual as well. The survivors were no longer just trying to survive. They were beginning to think on a higher plane, seeing the world in ways they never had before. Their minds were more open, more connected to one another. They were evolving into something more than human, something new. But with this evolution came new challenges. The survivors' powers were growing stronger, and they were learning to harness them in ways that were both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Some could manipulate the elements, earth, fire, water, and air, while others could move objects with their minds or heal wounds with a mere thought. They were learning to communicate telepathically, their thoughts blending together in a collective consciousness that was both thrilling and overwhelming. Yet, as they grew stronger, they also faced new dangers. The Yitar may have been gone, but their legacy lived on. The survivors soon discovered that they were not the only ones who had been altered by the virus. Other species, once thought to be destroyed by the plague, had also survived and adapted. These alien survivors, though few in number, were beginning to regroup, forming factions of their own. The survivors realized that they were no longer alone in the universe. The galaxy was teeming with life, but it was a life that had been shaped by the virus. Every species that had survived had evolved, and each was now a potential threat or ally. The survivors, with their newfound powers, knew that they had to be careful. Their very existence had disrupted the balance of power in the galaxy. They could no longer afford to be passive. They had to take control of their destiny. Dr. Matthews knew that they needed to find a way to unite the survivors, to forge a new path forward. But it was not going to be easy. There were those among the survivors who believed that the changes they had undergone were a sign of their superiority. They believed that they were destined to rule the galaxy, to bring order to a universe that had been left in chaos. These individuals were dangerous, and Dr. Matthews knew that if they were not stopped, they would sow discord among the survivors, pushing them into a war that they could not afford to fight. On the other side, the resistors, led by Alan Blackwood, were still a powerful force. They believed that the survivors' powers were unnatural and that humanity needed to return to its roots. Blackwood and his followers were determined to halt the changes, to reverse the evolution that had taken place. They saw the new abilities as a threat, something that would destroy humanity's humanity. They believed that the only way to survive was to reject the changes, to stay as they were before the virus. The divide between the factions deepened. The survivors were no longer united by the common goal of survival. They were now divided by their beliefs. Some saw their evolution as a blessing, a chance to rise above the ashes of the old world and build something new. Others saw it as a curse, a threat that would lead to their destruction. In the midst of this chaos, a new leader emerged. His name was Kalen, a survivor who had once been a simple farmer before the virus changed everything. Kalen had been one of the first to show signs of the virus's effects. He had developed powers that no one could explain, and his abilities were unlike anything the others had experienced. He could manipulate time itself, bending the flow of reality around him. But Kalen wasn't just powerful, he was a unifying force. He saw the potential for the survivors to come together, to forge a new future that transcended the divisions that threatened to tear them apart. Kalen began to rally the survivors, preaching a message of unity. He believed that humanity's evolution was not something to fear, it was something to embrace. He saw the power they had unlocked as a gift, a chance to rebuild the world and to create a future where humanity could rise above its past mistakes. But not everyone agreed with Kalen's vision. Many were still suspicious of the changes. afraid of what they might become. The resistors saw Callan as a dangerous leader, one who would lead them down a path of destruction. The survivors were at a crossroads. The choices they made in the coming days would shape the future of humanity and the future of the galaxy. Would they embrace their evolution, or would they reject it? Would they unite under Callan's leadership, or would they splinter into warring factions, each fighting for control of a world that was no longer the same? As the survivors faced this uncertainty, they knew one thing: the universe was vast, and the future was filled with possibilities. But only by coming together could they hope to face the challenges that lay ahead. The virus had changed them, but it had also given them a chance to shape their destiny. And now, it was up to them to decide what kind of future they would create. Would they rise above their past, or would they fall into chaos once again? The choice was theirs. The survivors had come a long way since the virus had first struck the Earth, but now they stood at a precipice, a crossroads that would decide the fate of humanity and the galaxy. The power they had unlocked within themselves was undeniable, but it was a double-edged sword. The evolution the virus had triggered had given them extraordinary abilities, but it had also exposed their deepest fears. The universe they now inhabited was one of uncertainty and danger, and they were no longer just a species fighting for survival. They were a force with the potential to shape the future, for better or worse. Callan, the leader who had emerged from the chaos, knew that the time had come to make a decision. The survivors could no longer afford to be passive, to wait and see what would happen. They had to take control of their destiny. But the path forward was unclear, and the divisions among the survivors were only growing wider. The resistors, led by Alan Blackwood, were becoming more vocal in their opposition to the changes. They saw the evolution as a threat to everything humanity had stood for, a dangerous mutation that would lead them down a path of destruction. On the other side, Callan's followers believed that the evolution was a blessing, an opportunity to rise above their past and create something new, something that transcended the mistakes of the old world. The tension between the factions reached a boiling point when Callan called for a meeting. It was time to make a decision, he said. They had to choose whether to embrace the new reality or to reject it and try to return to the old ways. The survivors gathered in a large open area, the remnants of the once great city now silent around them. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The world they had known was gone, and the choices they made now would determine whether they could rebuild or whether they would tear themselves apart. Callan stood before them, his presence commanding, his eyes filled with resolve. He spoke of unity, of the power they now possessed, and the potential it held. He spoke of the future, a future where humanity could rise above the ashes of the old world, a future where they could become the guardians of a new era. "We are no longer the species we once were," Callan said, his voice echoing in the silence. "We are more. We have been given a gift, a chance to evolve. And with that evolution comes responsibility. We cannot afford to let fear divide us. We must embrace the change and become something greater." But Alan Blackwood was not swayed. He stepped forward, his face hard with determination. "You speak of evolution as though it is something to be celebrated, Callan," he said, his voice laced with disdain. "But it's a curse. We were better off before this virus, before we were changed. These powers are unnatural, and they will lead us down a dark path. We cannot control them. And if we don't stop this, we will destroy ourselves. This is not progress. It's the end of humanity." The crowd was divided, whispers spreading among them. Some nodded in agreement with Callan, their faces filled with hope. Others looked to Blackwood, their expressions filled with fear and uncertainty. The divide between the two sides had never been so clear, and both knew that whatever decision was made would not come without consequences. Callan took a step forward, his voice quiet but firm. "I understand your fear, Alan," he said, "but this is not the end. This is the beginning. The virus gave us these abilities for a reason. We can use them to protect what is left of this world, to rebuild. to make sure that humanity doesn't just survive, but thrives. We are the next step in the evolution of our species. We can't turn back. The future is in our hands. The tension in the air was palpable. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, from the back of the crowd, a voice called out, "What about the others? The aliens? The ones who survived the virus like us? What if they don't want to work with us? What if they see us as a threat?" It was a question that had been on everyone's mind, but had never been voiced. The survivors had learned the hard way that they were not alone in the universe. The virus had affected more than just humanity. It had changed other species too. Some were already regrouping, building their own factions, and others might view the humans as a rival, or worse, as an enemy. Kalen's gaze hardened. We don't know what the other species will do. But we can't afford to wait and see. We must act. If we stand still, we risk being wiped out by those who want to control this new galaxy. We can't let fear dictate our future. Blackwood's voice rang out again, this time with even more urgency. And if you're wrong, Kalen, what if embracing this power means losing ourselves? What if we become the very thing we fought against? The question hung in the air like a dark cloud. Could they truly control the powers they had unlocked? Was there a danger that they would lose their humanity in the process, that the virus had created something beyond human understanding? It was a risk that none of them could ignore. But Kalen stood firm. I believe in us. I believe in humanity's ability to adapt and evolve. We have always been a species that rises to challenges, that pushes forward, even when the odds are stacked against us. The virus didn't destroy us. It gave us the chance to become something more. We can shape the future we want. We just have to be brave enough to take that first step. The crowd fell silent once more. The decision had been made. The survivors would move forward, embracing the changes they had undergone. They would not turn back to the past. They would face the future, uncertain and dangerous as it might be, with courage and unity. But even as the survivors began to rally around Kalen's vision, they knew that the road ahead would be far from easy. The galaxy was full of challenges, and not all of them would be friendly. The alien factions that had once been part of the larger galaxy were still out there, and many of them were just as evolved as the humans, if not more so. The survivors would need to find a way to coexist with these new powers, to create alliances and build a new order that was not based on fear and violence, but on cooperation and mutual respect. Kalen's vision was only the beginning. The survivors had taken the first step toward a new future, but they knew that there would be trials ahead. They would have to learn to use their powers wisely, to control them and ensure that they didn't fall into the same traps that had destroyed the alien civilizations before them. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: humanity had survived. And now, they would thrive. With a renewed sense of purpose, Kalen addressed the survivors one last time. This is our time. Together, we will build a future worthy of the sacrifices we've made. We will rise above the ashes of the old world and create something new, something that will last. We are no longer just humans. We are the next step in the evolution of life itself, and we will not be stopped. The survivors, now united in their resolve, looked toward the stars. They had no idea what lay ahead, but they were ready to face it. The journey had only just begun, and they were determined to see it through, no matter the cost.